Hi, everyone. Okay. As we all know, over 2 years ago, the world locked down. Schools closed, workplaces went remote. We all tried to socially distance from one another. But not all places could do this. Prisons, they tried to lock down. They stopped all programming. They prohibited all visitations. They restricted movements within facilities. But these approaches, they simply isolated incarcerated people into already overcrowded, poorly ventilated spaces. Prisons couldn't provide enough masks. Cleaning supplies were in short supply. Even bar soap was being rationed early in the pandemic. These were extreme conditions, and they continue to be extreme conditions as we're here today. And at the same time, officers were continuing to move back and forth between their homes and communities and prisons every day. And so it was only a matter of time before COVID reached prisons and engulfed them. Since the pandemic began, 254 people have died of COVID-19 in California prisons alone. The majority of incarcerated people have tested positive. In many prisons throughout the state, nearly 100% of people incarcerated have tested positive. It didn't have to be this way. Early on in the pandemic, the federal government actually urged states to release their most medically vulnerable people, people who are in their 60s and in their 70s, and no real threat to public safety. And yet our state's administrators and elected officials largely ignored the federal government's advice. And instead, in an effort to reduce overcrowding, what they did was they moved people around. They moved people around within facilities, between facilities, and this simply led to more COVID spread and infection. The crisis going on right now in California prisons reflects a larger crisis in America. It reflects our decades-long experiment in mass incarceration, in which extreme punishment, like solitary confinement, life without parole, systematic racial inequalities have all become the norm in our country. So in response to this crisis, we started Prison Pandemic to collect firsthand stories of people incarcerated in California prisons and jails. In fall 2020, we set up a hotline to receive collect calls from prisons. We wrote tens of thousands of letters to people incarcerated in prisons and jails, and we partnered with dozens of community groups throughout the state in order to spread the word about this project. As of now, we've collected nearly 4,000 stories from people incarcerated throughout all of California's prisons, all 35 of them, throughout most of California's jails, many of the federal prisons and immigration detention facilities throughout the state. Nearly 1,400 of these stories are on our website, prisonpandemic.uci.edu. And we are working on getting thousands more on this site in the coming months. For me, working on Prison Pandemic over the last 2 years has really been a bright spot. Prison Pandemic has brought together dozens of faculty and staff from across the campus. We have worked with and trained literally hundreds of UCI undergraduate students over this time. And we have collaborated with dozens of community groups throughout the entire state, all in the shared goal to increase transparency about what is going on in our state's prisons and jails. Listening to the stories and hearing about people's experiences in their own unfiltered words is deeply affecting. Some people describe just horrific conditions, of feeling incredibly sick, being moved to a large, cold gym filled with literally hundreds of other sick and infected people, and not being able to talk to a nurse or a doctor or any medical professional for weeks while being sick. But many people also talk about their loved ones, about feeling scared, about their medically vulnerable family members on the outside who they cannot be in touch with. Some describe losing a mother or a father due to COVID and not finding out about it for weeks, and in one case, months after it has happened. And we hear incarcerated parents many times talking about their fears about their kids. We hear them talking about just not feeling worried that their young kids are not going to recognize who they are after over a year without in-person visits. And you can hear all of these stories on our site. In the last few weeks, Prison Pandemic has actually received several large grants after operating on a shoestring budget for most of this time. These ensure that this collection of stories, which is the only collection of stories by incarcerated people that we are aware of in this country, it ensures that this collection is permanently archived and publicly accessible in the decades to come in the UCI libraries. Our hope is that Prison Pandemic can help break down the barriers between our communities and these carceral facilities, that we can use this archive to understand what is happening, what has happened, to learn from this crisis, and to prevent another one from happening in the future. Thank you.